Nitrogen passes between living organisms and the non-living world in biogeochemical cycle known as the global nitrogen cycle. In organisms, this element is one of the most abundant and is required in DNA, RNA, and proteins. In our largest nitrogen reservoir, the atmosphere and the nitrogen gas is the most abundant gas, which make up to 78% of the air we breathe. Although it is ubiquitous in the environment, nitrogen gas is not accessible to most living organisms. Only certain types of bacteria, which is the nitrogen fixers, can break the nitrogen gas triple bond and thereby tap this atmospheric reservoir. In aquatic systems, primary productivity occurs in surface waters, and some nitrogen is recycled locally in these waters. Much of the nitrogen, however, is recycled at the greater depths in water column as organisms in depth waters intercept and consume sinking detritus. Some of the nitrogen sinks to the bottom and accumulates in sediments, with a small amount later returned to the surface by upwelling. Nitrogen gas is the most abundant gas in this atmosphere, which make up to 78% of the air we breathe, yet it is commonly in short supply in biological communities. Most organisms cannot use nitrogen gas to make their essential nitrogen-containing molecules such as proteins and DNA. The two nitrogen atoms in nitrogen gas are connected by an extremely stable and triple bond, which does not easily break. Much of the nitrogen taken up by plants is recycled locally through decomposition of dead organic matter in soils, which again releases ammonium and nitrate. Some nitrogen, however, is leached from soils and carried away by the movement of water, and some of this accessible nitrogen ultimately enters lakes and oceans. Just a few species of bacteria and archaea, called nitrogen fixers, can break the N2 triple bond. In a process called nitrogen fixation, these microbes convert N2 into NH4. Other microbes convert NH4 into NO2 and NO3, and then plants use NO3 or NH4 to produce nitrogen-containing organic molecules. By consuming plants, animals also obtain usable forms of nitrogen.
Nitrogen fixation. Certain plants, especially of the legume family, have a special type of soil bacteria living in small rounded outgrowths on their roots called nodules. Now, these bacteria are able to directly fix atmospheric nitrogen, convert them into nitrites, nitrates, and make them available to the plant. Some free-living bacteria live in the soil and possess the ability to fix free nitrogen of the air and convert them into ammonia, amino acids, and proteins. For example, Azobacter, that is, aerobic bacteria. Bacteria belonging to the genus Rhizobium infect root hairs and gain entry into the cortex. The cortical cells divide to form a nodule within which the bacteria grows. The plant provides the bacteria with shelter and carbon compounds, while the bacteria, in return, supplies the plant with nitrogenous compounds.
Denitrification is the process that converts nitrate to nitrogen gas, thus removing bioavailable nitrogen and returning it to the atmosphere. The nitrogen gas is the ultimate end product of denitrification, but the other intermediate gaseous forms of nitrogen exist.
Denitrification, which occurs when soil is wet and oxygen deprived. Microorganisms strip oxygen from nitrate, producing gases that escape to the air and can mean the loss of up to 60% of your applied N. ESN is unique in its ability to protect N all season from all loss mechanisms.
For the third one, the decomposers, or the process of decomposition. So how does this process happen? As mentioned in the previous slides, nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the soil help in transforming atmospheric nitrogen into compounds that can be used. And while these plants absorb these compounds, living organisms such as animals that consumes or eat these plants will enter their body. Now, the question is, how will the nitrogen get back into the atmosphere? This is by the process of decomposition. When this when these living things die, their remains are buried in the soil where the bacteria or the so-called decomposers break them down. These bacteria break down complex nitrogen containing compounds into more straightforward nitrogen containing compounds like ammonia or nitrates. And this, in fact, by serving as a plant nutrient, these nitrates can be recycled once more. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Carissa Macy Abella of Group 2. So, human activities that could be avoided to lessen the negative effects of nitrogen cycle. Some of the examples are burning of fossil fuels and too much use of nitrogen fertilizers. So, the nitrogen cycle involves many natural feedback relationships between plants and microorganisms. Excess nitrogen by human activities pollutes freshwaters and coastal zones and may contribute to climate change. People using fertilizers, such as farmers, are applied inefficiently, and as a result, 60% of the nitrogen contained in applied fertilizer is never incorporated into plants and then pollutes rivers, lakes, and coastal areas through eutrophication. Then the plant's nutrients are used up and the plant dies and decomposes. Thank you. Here are some of the importance of nitrogen cycle. Well, first, plants production. Plants production, when plants do not get enough nitrogen, they are unable to produce amino acids that make up many living cells, muscles, and tissue. Well, without amino acids, plants cannot make the special proteins that the plant cells need to grow. Without enough nitrogen, plant growth is affected negatively. The nitrogen cycle help brings in the inert nitrogen from the air into the biochemical process in plants and then to animals. And then next, healthy ecosystems. Well, nitrogen is an essential nutrient for sustaining life on Earth. The air we breathe contains 78% nitrogen and 21% oxygen, and the remaining are the other trace gases. And the next, crucial to life. Well, nitrogen is also essential to life, right? Since we found nitrogen in the food and drink we take every day, nitrogen is important to all living things, including us. It is necessary for our food supply, but excess nitrogen can harm the environment. Thank you.
Good day, I am Mark Cordero and this time I will discuss about the effects of surplus and deficit of nitrogen in our environment. We all know that nitrogen is considered one of the major components of CHONPS, a group of elements that are responsible and necessary for proper life growth of all living organisms that exist within our planet. Now my question is, what will happen if there is too much or too little nitrogen present in our environment? So we will first discuss about the effects of having surplus nitrogen in the environment. Too much nitrogen can cause coastal dead zones and fish kills. And it happens due to severe eutrophication, which was brought by large amounts of nitrate leaching into different water systems. Too much nitrogen can also cause biodiversity loss due to eutrophication partnered with acidification. that damages the habitat of living organisms, while eutrophication and acidification alone also contaminates groundwater and freshwater systems. Too much nitrogen can cause human health impacts, such as respiratory diseases, since nitrogen promotes the formation of aerosol and tropospheric ozone, both main components of smoke. Also, too much nitrogen deposition and over-fertilization can cause reduced crop productivity, in which it outweighs the benefits of nitrogen for plants. Lastly, too much nitrogen in the atmosphere speeds up the depletion of ozone layer, further aggravating the global climate change. This time, we will now discuss the effects of having deficit nitrogen in the environment. Too little nitrogen can cause stunted growth in plants and crops, since plants rely on nitrogen to produce the cells required for proper growth and photosynthesis. Too little nitrogen also causes oligotrophication in terrestrial ecosystems, in which it happens when there is little to no nitrogen content available within the soil. Too little nitrogen in the environment can cause abnormality in all living organisms, since they are reliant to nitrogen for proper cell production and function. When nitrogen is decreased, the chance of complex life forms to survive is also affected. Too little nitrogen present will lead to reduced ammonia production, and it is not good because ammonia is the main ingredient of fertilizers. Lastly, too little nitrogen can cause imbalances in atmosphere composition, since nitrogen acts as a diluent in atmosphere. Due to its stability, oxygen levels will increase and make things more flammable and oxidizing if nitrogen levels are reduced. So moving on to the next part, I will now discuss eutrophication and the ways on how we can prevent it. First, eutrophication is the process in which a high concentration of nutrients, mainly nitrogen and phosphorus, infiltrate a body of water. These nutrients serve as a food source for microorganisms, algae, and plankton. When food is abundant for these organisms, an algal bloom occurs. This can create a new life entering the water ecosystem, which it also leads to a higher mortality rate within the ecosystem. Dead and decaying organisms sink to the bottom of the lake, and decomposition saps oxygen from water. With the lack of oxygen, other life forms like fish and plants begin to die. It leads to a dead zone, a body of water where no aquatic animals can live. Eutrophication occurs naturally in nature. However, human activity can aggravate the process. There are two types of eutrophication. Natural eutrophication is the gradual buildup of nutrients, organic material, and sediments that takes place over centuries in many water basins, while cultural eutrophication refers to an alteration of nutrient input in the water basins by human activities that lead to major ecological changes in water bodies over the decades. When it comes to preventing eutrophication, there are several methods and strategies that concerned people can use. These are nutrient management techniques, year-round ground cover, planting field buffers, conservation tillage, riparian buffer zones, fertilizer regulation, soil nitrogen testing, and organic farming. Before I end my part, I just want to share and play a short video that summarizes the concept of eutrophication.
Eutrophication is a process that can happen in a water body, like a river or lake, when too many nutrients are added to the system. Eutrophication starts when fertilizers, which are rich in nutrients like nitrate and phosphate, are washed into the river or lake system. This leads to an increase in nutrient concentrations in the water. The nutrients are food for algae, and the algae grow and reproduce quickly, forming a thick green bloom in the water. This algal bloom will absorb sunlight shining on the water, so the sunlight can't reach the bottom. Plants who need this light to photosynthesize will die. The algae will also start to die when they eat up all of the nutrients and run out of food. Next, bacteria start to break down the dead plants and algae, and that releases more nutrients back into the water, continuing the algal bloom cycle. The bacteria, with a continuing supply of food, reproduce into much larger numbers, consuming oxygen as they grow and respire. There's not much oxygen in the water to begin with, so when the bacteria consume it quickly, it might run out completely. Water without oxygen is called anoxic. If the water turns anoxic, all non-bacterial life in the water, including fish and other animals, will die. So, eutrophication happens when nutrients are added to water, which causes an algal bloom, cutting off sunlight and feeding bacteria. The bacteria use up oxygen in the water, which becomes anoxic, causing everything living in the water to die. Eutrophication is one reason why we need to be careful with fertilizers when we're growing crops.
To review, we have tackled about the nitrogen cycle, its background, importance, and the ways that it can be recycled, which are the nitrogen fixation, the nitrification, and decomposition. We have also talked about eutrophication, which is a serious environmental concern for us people, and how we could prevent this. And lastly, the various ways on how we can eliminate or lessen the negative effects of nitrogen cycle. Just a note, humans have interfered significantly in the global nitrogen cycle. Before the production and mass use of fertilizers, usable nitrogen containing compounds were in short supply in the environment. However, nowadays humans are currently using as much fixed nitrogen in the form of fertilizers. Usable nitrogen is now overly abundant in the environment, and this having negative consequences. In fact, the excess nitrogen from fertilizers contaminates our groundwater, lakes, rivers, and oceans. It also affects our aquatic ecosystems, which upsets the balance of life, favoring the growth of algae at the expense of other organisms. Because of this, we constantly need to be reminded of the nitrogen cycle's significance in our lives and the potential harm it can cause. Yes, nitrogen cycle is very vital to life in our world. Without nitrogen, there would be no life on Earth. Nitrogen exists in every living thing, and every cell needs nitrogen to stay alive, grow, and reproduce. However, if our environment contains an excessive amount of excess nitrogen, there are some things we should take into account. For the sake of the coming generation, we should therefore take immediate action to lessen the negative effects the nitrogen cycle could possibly bring us. That's all. Thank you.